A man's laughter can burn a whole town, but God's justice rides slower, steadier, and it never misses its target. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now and listen to this story carefully, because this is not just a story. This is a warning. A wealthy cattle baron in the heart of the Wild West laughed at a dusty rancher's daughter in front of the entire town, thinking his money and his guns made him untouchable. He thought wrong, because that rancher picked up something far more powerful than a pistol. He picked up his dignity, and dignity in the end always wins. The year was 1879. The town of Redstone Canyon sat baking under a merciless Texas sun, caught between red rock cliffs and dry riverbeds that only filled when God felt generous. It was a hard town for hard people, cowboys, ranchers, blacksmiths, and farmers who woke before dawn and slept after dark and never once complained about the life they had chosen. Among them lived a man named Caleb Horn, tall, sunburned, quiet as canyon wind, with hands rough as saddle leather and eyes steady as a rifle sight. He had built his small ranch from nothing, losing his wife to fever 4 winters back, and had raised his daughter May alone ever since. May Horn was 16 years old and carried her mother's dark eyes and her father's unbreakable spine. She wore simple cotton dresses, rode her horse better than most grown men in Redstone Canyon, and had a laugh that made even the oldest, weariest cowboys smile without knowing why. Every Sunday morning she rode with her father to the edge of their land, and they would sit together on their horses watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls, red and gold and amber. In those quiet moments, Caleb felt that despite everything he had lost, God had still been generous with him. May was proof of that. The annual Redstone Canyon Founders Day celebration was the biggest event of the year, a full day of music, food, horse races, and dancing that brought every soul within 50 miles into town. Caleb had saved carefully for months to buy May a proper dress for the occasion, cream-colored with small blue flowers, the finest thing sold at the general store. When May came out wearing it that morning, Caleb stood at the door of their ranch house and could not speak for a full 10 seconds. She looked so much like her mother that his chest physically ached. He cleared his throat and said, "Your mama would be real proud." Riding into Redstone Canyon that same morning was a man named Colonel Douglas Harlan, not a real colonel, just a title he had bought along with everything else he owned. He controlled 300,000 acres of cattle land, the town bank, the saloon, and half the sheriff's office through carefully placed bribes. He arrived in a gleaming black coach pulled by 4 matched horses, dressed in a white suit that had never seen a single day of honest work. Douglas Harlan was the kind of man who had never been told no, and that long absence of the word no had turned something inside him permanently rotten. It happened near the water trough outside the general store. May's horse had spooked slightly at the noise of the crowd and bumped against the side of Harlan's expensive coach, leaving a small dusty mark on the polished black wood. Harlan stepped out, looked at the mark, looked at May on her horse, and then looked at the crowd gathered around with the slow, theatrical confidence of a man who enjoyed an audience. He laughed, a loud, cutting laugh, and said, "Careful, girl. That coach costs more than your daddy's entire sorry little patch of dirt. Maybe he should teach you to control a horse before he dresses you up like you belong here." Caleb Horn was standing 10 feet away talking to the blacksmith when every word landed on him like a branding iron. He turned slowly. The crowd had gone quiet the way crowds go quiet when they sense something serious is about to happen. Caleb walked toward Harlan with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision somewhere between the first step and the last. He stopped directly in front of Douglas Harlan and looked at him with eyes that had nothing fearful in them, only something ancient and immovable, like the canyon walls themselves. Harlan raised an eyebrow, one hand drifting casually toward the 2 armed men flanking him. Caleb did not reach for his gun. He did not raise his voice. He looked Douglas Harlan directly in the eye and said, low and clear, "You laughed at my daughter." Harlan stared at him for a moment, then smiled slowly and spread his hands wide as if performing for the crowd. "And what exactly are you planning to do about it, dirt farmer?" Caleb held his gaze for 3 long seconds without blinking. Then he said, "Nothing today, Harlan. But there is a God above these canyon walls. And he has been watching you a long time. Your day is coming, and when it does, I want you to remember this moment." Then Caleb turned, walked back to May, and said quietly, "Head up."
"Darling, always."
Harlan laughed loudly, said something crude to his men, and walked into the saloon. The crowd exhaled. Some people shook their heads. Others looked at the ground, ashamed of their own silence. "Old pastor." Jenkins put a hand on Caleb's shoulder and said nothing, just squeezed once. May did not cry in public. She held her chin up all day through the celebration, danced twice, ate her pie, and smiled at everyone who smiled at her. But that night, lying in her small bed in the ranch house while coyotes called in the dark distance, she let the tears come quietly into her pillow so her father would not hear. Caleb sat on the porch that night under a sky absolutely drowning in stars, his rifle across his knees, not out of anger but out of habit. And he thought for a long time. He was not thinking about Harlan. He was thinking about May, about her future, about what kind of world she would inherit, about whether a man like him could give her something strong enough to stand on when he was gone. He looked out at his land, dry, cracked, not much to look at in the dark. And he thought about the underground, water his father had always sworn was running beneath the east pasture. Nobody had ever drilled for it. Tonight, Caleb decided somebody would. He spent the next 3 weeks doing something the people of Redstone Canyon had never seen him do. He went to the library in the next town over, sat at a table for hours every day, and read everything he could find about water drilling, cattle breeding, land rights, and territorial law. He filled a worn leather notebook with careful notes written in his slow, deliberate handwriting. Then he wrote a letter to a land development office in Austin, describing his property and the likely underground water source. 6 weeks later, 2 surveyors arrived at his ranch, spent 4 days testing the east pasture, and confirmed what his father had always believed. There was water, deep, clean, and abundant. With a territorial land improvement loan and every dollar he had saved over 12 years, Caleb drilled the well. When the water came up, cold and clear and strong, 3 ranch hands who had been watching took off their hats, and one of them knelt down right there in the dirt. Word spread through Redstone Canyon within hours. In a land where water was everything, Caleb Horn had just become something nobody expected. A man with something everyone needed. Ranches started coming to him. Deals were made. Partnerships formed. Within 1 year, Caleb's land had tripled in productive value, and his cattle herd had grown from 40 head to nearly 300. May never stopped learning through all of it. She kept her own notebook, asked sharper questions than most grown men, and had an instinct for cattle and land that made the old ranchers shake their heads in quiet admiration. When she turned 19, she rode alone to Austin, walked into the Territorial Land Office, and filed a formal legal complaint documenting Douglas Harlan's years of fraudulent land seizures from smaller ranchers, backed by testimony she had spent 8 months quietly collecting from families, too afraid to speak alone but willing to speak together. The territorial attorney looked at her, documentation for a long time, and then looked up at her and said, "Young lady, where did you learn to do this?" May looked at him calmly and said, "From my father. He taught me that dignity is the one thing no man can take from you, and that the law, when it works right, is just dignity written down." The investigation that followed took 14 months. It was thorough, relentless, and completely damaging. Douglas Harlan's fraudulent land deeds were exposed. His bank was placed under territorial receivership, and 3 of his hired men turned witness against him in exchange for reduced charges. On a gray Tuesday morning in the fall of 1885, Douglas Harlan was escorted out of his grand Redstone Canyon mansion by a territorial marshal while half the town watched from the street. Part 2, paragraphs 15 to 28. Caleb Horn heard about Harlan's arrest from Pastor Jenkins, who rode out to the ranch specifically to deliver the news in person. Caleb was mending a fence post when the pastor arrived, and he listened to the whole account without changing his expression very much. When Jenkins finished, Caleb drove the last nail into the post, picked up his tools and said quietly, "Good, that was all." No celebration, no satisfaction dancing in his eyes. Just that one word, said the way a man says it when something that was broken has finally been set right. Jenkins studied him for a moment and then said, "You're not even going to smile?" Caleb glanced at him. "I'm smiling on the inside, Pastor." What nobody in Redstone Canyon knew, not even May, was that Caleb had been quietly sick for the better part of a year. A persistent cough that the town doctor had been watching with increasing concern had worsened through the winter. And 3 months before Harlan's arrest, the doctor had delivered news that Caleb had received a loan, sitting in the small examination room with his hat in his hands. It was serious. Manageable, the doctor said carefully, with rest and treatment, but serious. Caleb had nodded, put his hat back on, ridden home, and told no one. He had work to finish first. May found out on a cold February morning when she came into the kitchen before dawn and found her father sitting at the table with the doctor's letter open in front of him. She read it standing up, still in her coat. And when she finished, she sat down across from him, very slowly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind was moving through the canyon in low, steady waves. Finally, May looked at her father and said, "How long have you known?" Caleb met her eyes, those dark, steady eyes so much like her mother's, and said, "Long enough to know you're going to be just fine. Without me." May reached across the table and took both his hands. "You're not going anywhere, Papa." She was right, and wrong at the same time. Caleb did not die, but he did spend 4 months bedridden while May ran the ranch alone with the help of 2 loyal hands who had worked for Caleb for years and refused any suggestion of leaving. She woke before dawn, worked until dark, made every decision, solved every problem, and never once let the ranch fall behind the other ranches in the territory. Watched what she was doing, and word spread in the quiet, respectful way that genuine admiration spreads in small communities, not loudly but permanently. By the time Caleb was well enough to sit on the porch again, May had become something the territory had not quite seen before. Douglas Harlan lost everything in the legal proceedings: his land, his bank, his reputation, and finally his mansion, which was auctioned by the territorial court to partially compensate the families he had defrauded over the years. On the day of the auction, Harlan stood on the road outside and watched strangers walk through his front door to appraise his belongings. He was 61 years old, alone, and had not a single friend willing to stand beside him. His hired guns had scattered. His business partners had publicly distanced themselves. The sheriff he had bribed for years had turned the bribe money over to the court as evidence. He had nothing left but the clothes he was wearing. 3 days after losing the mansion, Harlan appeared at the edge of Caleb's property on foot. No horse, no coach, no men, just an old man walking a dusty road in a white suit that was no longer white. Caleb saw him coming from the porch and watched him approach without moving. May came and stood beside her father. Harlan stopped at the fence, looked at Caleb, and then looked at May. He opened his mouth twice before anything came out. Then in a voice stripped of every performance, every layer of arrogance and theater, a voice that was just tired and broken and bare, he said, "I am sorry, Miss Horn, for what I said. For all of it." May looked at him for a long time. She was 20 years old now, not the 16-year-old girl in the cream dress who had sat quietly while a crowd laughed. She had run a ranch alone, filed legal documents that dismantled an empire, nursed her father through illness, and built something real from the ground up. She could have said many things. She chose carefully. "Mr. Harlan," she said evenly, "I accepted what you said that day the moment it happened, because I decided right. Then that your opinion of me was your problem, not mine. I don't need your apology, but I believe you need to give it, so I accept it, for your sake." Harlan stood there at the fence for a moment longer, nodded once, and then looked at Caleb. The 2 men regarded each other. Across the fence in silence, the rancher who had built everything slowly and honestly, and the baron who had taken everything quickly and dishonestly, and who now had nothing. Caleb unlatched the fence gate. He did not open it wide. He just unlatched it and said, "There's coffee inside if you want it. And we've got work here if you need it. Real work with your hands." Harlan looked down at his soft, uncalloused hands and then back up at Caleb. Something in the old baron's eyes broke open quietly. He pushed the gate and walked through. Douglas Harlan worked on the Horn Ranch for 2 years. He slept in the small bunkhouse with the ranch hands, woke at dawn, mucked stalls, mended fences, fed cattle, and learned for the first time in his life what it felt like to be genuinely tired from honest labor. He was not good at it in the beginning. The hands had to show him. Everything twice and sometimes 3 times. But he never complained and never quit. Slowly his hands roughened. His posture changed. The theatrical confidence was replaced by something quieter and more real. The ranch hands, who had been coldly skeptical, began including him without fanfare in their conversations at the end of the day. In the spring of his 2nd year on the E, Ranch Harlan used his remaining knowledge of land law and cattle markets, the one genuinely valuable thing his corrupt empire had given him, to help May negotiate a landmark water rights agreement with 4 neighboring ranches that secured the Horn property's water access for the next 50 years. The territorial attorney who had prosecuted Harlan's case heard about the agreement and wrote May a personal letter, calling it the most sophisticated land negotiation he had seen from a private rancher in 15 years of practice. May kept the letter in the same drawer as her father's old notebook. The town of Redstone Canyon held its Founders' Day celebration again that summer, 26 years after the one where everything had changed. May rode into town on a fine horse, dressed simply, her dark eyes calm and steady. People stepped aside not out of fear but out of genuine respect, the kind that cannot be performed or purchased. Caleb rode beside her, older now, a little slower, but straight in the saddle with that same immovable quiet that had always defined him. When they passed the spot near the water trough outside the general store, neither of them said anything. But Caleb reached over and briefly touched his daughter's hand. She nodded once. They rode on. That evening at the celebration, old Pastor Jenkins stood up to make his annual remarks and said something. He had been saving for a long time. He talked about what real wealth looked like. Not land deeds or cattle counts or bank accounts, but the kind of wealth that showed up in how a person carried themselves when the world tried to knock them down. He did not name anyone. He did not need to. Every person sitting in that town square knew exactly who he was talking about. And in the back of the gathering, sitting on a simple wooden bench with roughened hands wrapped around a tin cup, Douglas Harlan listened to every word with his head bowed and his eyes closed. Caleb Horn turned 60 that autumn. May organized a quiet gathering at the ranch, just the hands, the neighboring families, Pastor Jenkins and one reformed old baron who showed up early and spent the afternoon helping set up tables without being asked. At the end of the evening, May stood and spoke about her father, about the man who had taught her to ride, to read, to fight with law instead of guns, to forgive without forgetting, and above all, to keep her head up in every weather. When she finished, the whole gathering was quiet in that specific way that only genuine emotion creates. Not awkward silence, but full silence. The kind that means everyone is feeling the same true thing at once. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Caleb and May sat on the porch the way they always had, looking out at their land, listening to the canyon breathe in the dark. The well was still running,